Mr. Becerra.
Good afternoon. Ryan Becerra from Barkowitz, Chronic, and Shanahan. On behalf of a number of upstream agencies, unlike Mr. Rubin, I am here rather often, it seems. I would like to comment on the same point, and I do work with NACWA and Regional Water Authority, who signed the letter. And I want to comment again on this ambiguity of the term natural flow regime, more natural flow regime. It's been in the Delta Plan or the draft Delta Plan for months at this point. And I was hoping the EIR would provide, one, some clarity as to what it meant, and two, some clarity as to the impacts. And to Mr. Fiorini's point earlier, the EIR really doesn't provide much information on this point. It repeats the phrase more natural flow regime over and over and over. I mean, I think dozens of times. I think I stopped counting at about 25. And it doesn't talk about what impacts that may have. It doesn't have any specificity. And the thing that's really crucial to the interests that I work with is what does that do to storage in reservoirs? And the reason that's crucial is a more natural flow regime, at least as I interpret it, would probably mean storing less water in the winter and spring rain and snowmelt seasons. And that necessarily reduces storage in the reservoirs. And that has potentially two very crucial impacts on not only the way people operate, but on the state's ability to achieve the co-equal goals. The first is water supply reliability. If you can't tell how much water is in the reservoirs, you can't tell how much reliability you're going to have. And the second is on the ecosystem point. In order to manage the current system to benefit anadromous species, salmon and steelhead, in the tributaries, you need to very carefully manage the cold water pools in the reservoirs upstream. That's what the water forum is based on the American River. That's what the UBO Accord is based on. That's what the Feather River 401 certification is based on, temperature management. And you can't tell how those two crucial things, water supply reliability and impacts on anadromous species, will be impacted if you can't tell what happens to reservoir storage. And so if you're putting out there a more natural flow regime that's going to require, to my mind, the concept is less storage, more variability of flows during the winter and spring. That concept does lead to a very significant amount of uncertainty as to can you achieve the co-equal goals. And so I think a very fundamental point underlying the Ag-Urban letter that you got yesterday was, what is it do you mean, and how can we assess whether or not the co-equal goals are going to be implemented? Because we've been waiting for some definition on this from the Council. In the draft plan, in the EIR, we just haven't seen it. And so when you head into a regulatory proceeding like what the State Board is handling, and Mr. Rubin's correct, they're asking for what are the alternatives you think we should consider as regulatory objectives. It is very concerning to see this body talking about sending a pretty vague letter saying, please go do this thing, without a lot of analysis or discussion as to what it means for the co-equal goals. And to my mind, this council should take a look at that letter before it goes out. You've got the time. It's only March 29th. The comments aren't due till April 25th. You've got the time to look at a draft and see what it means. So to my mind, ask your staff to bring you back a draft so that you can see it at the next meeting and you can have a good discussion as to whether or not this is where you think the state should go in trying to achieve the co-equal goals. Thank you.
Mr. Becerra, is behind this whole issue the old fight that some people are arguing that the 2010 flow criteria, I guess it was a flow objective report mandated by the legislature and directed only at environmental considerations, that is somehow still on the table at the Water Board hearing?
No.
And you understand we've agreed that it is not a full reflection
Absolutely.
of the balancing test. And in fact, the draft Delta Plan points out that flow for ecosystem must be balanced with other recognized.
The problem is taking a position that heads towards, I mean, I understand 75% is probably not on the table, but an approach that says release more of the water that comes in the winter and spring and don't store it which is essentially what a more natural flow regime may look like,
Phil?
even headed down that way has potentially significant impacts, and it's very important to get specificity.
Pat?
Brian? Do you think that a more natural regime for flows trumps the co-equal goals in our mind, or serves them?
It should serve them.
Right. So your worst case example wouldn't fit the co-equal goals. So that wouldn't be a way that a more natural flow regime would be described, set as a goal, or implemented.
It shouldn't, but again, we were looking to the EIR to provide us with a significant amount of clarity and analysis as to what it means.
It seems like in your remarks and in the letter you focus on this more natural flow regime and say we've raised that to a pedestal and we're going to worship that, and that's going to have the effect of doing the 70-30 example that previously was described and which you reference. But in fact, we're guided, and the law is clear, that the co-equal goals determine how we look at all those issues. And so the regime for flows would serve the co-equal goals, not the other way around.
The thing that really concerns me when I look at the EIR, it says in multiple places that the proposed project is better than several of the alternatives because it will achieve a more natural flow regime more quickly. And so to my mind, a key component of your proposed project analyzed in the EIR is that, achieving that specific flow regime more quickly. And as I said, I know I was hoping that the EIR would provide a great deal of clarity and analysis as to what that part of the fifth draft of the Delta Plan meant, that page 112 that talks about creating a more natural flow regime. And unfortunately, it doesn't. And so the water community, as reflected in that ag-urban letter, is coming from the perspective of having waited to see some analysis in the EIR and having not gotten any specificity on it. And so having not had that, if we'd had more specificity in the EIR and we could understand it, we could react more clearly and more specifically to the kind of proposal that item 8A reflects. At this point, we can't. And we don't understand what you're proposing in terms of what is in the fifth draft of the Delta Plan. And so you are getting a letter that's not very specific, that is pretty generalized, and does reflect a certain amount of concern based on what we don't understand.
Mr. Grindstaff.
I guess I understand some of the fears. I do want to point out that as we talk today, the National Academies talks about a more natural flow regime, and in their definition, the principal component is there is less diversion during dry years. And I think we have deliberately not tried to define it, but to indicate that the science says that moving that direction is better for species. Certainly you have to do that in conjunction with what works in the system, and that holistic approach, as you guys have referred to, is clearly something that the Council supports and has supported from the beginning. That doesn't mean we don't need to, according to our science anyway, look at doing what we can to address those flow issues that might actually help the ecosystem. And I think the fears that the Council is pushing to focus everything on flow are, at least in my view, and I understand I'm not an advocate anymore, I have been in the past, I'm not an advocate for one party or another. I think they're overblown. I mean, the Council has taken on several difficult issues and been very assertive. Probably the first one was actually dealing with nitrogen, and asking the lead scientist to actually go and appear before the regional board and say, this is clearly a stressor. Flows fit into that same category. The council also took a strong position in terms of predation and saying to the Fish and Game Commission, you really need to address this issue. So I think we can't do any less in dealing with flow, which clearly is, as some scientists call it, a master variable in the system. And so I think that's where the council's going. It's not, and I understand how hard it is to describe that in an EIR, and I understand that may not totally allay your fears, but I think it's also wrong to assume that the council, with these people here, are going to go do something reckless that wrecks this system, because that's clearly not their intent.
And I'd suggest, it sounds like the National Academy report may be very useful to you. I'd suggest you take some time and take a look at it and then bring a draft letter back for the council's consideration at that point. At this point, I don't mean to say that I think the council is focusing strictly on flow. I mean, clearly you've got a lengthy Delta plan, you've got a 2,000-page EIR. What concerns me is that the EIR identifies implementing a more natural flow regime as a crucial aspect of your proposed Delta Plan project with not much definition and less analysis. I mean, there's no analysis in here as to what it does to reservoir storage. There's just no analysis in the EIR on that, and that is crucial.
Mr. Becerra, how do you then expect us to comply with the statutory mandate in Water Code Section 85302, E4, which is a direction of what will be in the Delta Plan? And it says, restore delta flows and channels to support a healthy estuary and other ecosystems. That's a statute.
Let me pull it up in my copy of the statute.
Okay. The following sub-goals and strategies for restoring a healthy ecosystem shall be included in the Delta Plan is the preface. And improving water quality is there too. I mean, what does that suggest to you, that we must say, no, flows will never be changed or should never be changed?
I haven't said that today. No. I haven't said that at all. What I've said is that you're jumping into a regulatory process where the State Board is asking you and everyone else in the world, what are the potential alternatives we should consider in going forward with a Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan update? That's what this letter is about. And on the issue of flow, all that we've got at this point is more natural flow regime. And it's been in the fifth draft of the Delta Plan for months. That doesn't define it. We had an EIR come out that doesn't define it, that doesn't say what the impacts of implementing it would be, and yet says in many places this is a crucial aspect of the project that causes our proposed project to be a better environmental alternative than other alternatives. And so we're getting pretty far down the line on this without any definition of what the EIR says is a key component of the project. And so,
do you want us to propose to the Water Board set standards? I mean, no, I think we wouldn't do it, but is that what you want us to do?
I think you need to talk about and flesh out what it is operationally, what are the kinds of principles you're talking about when you say more natural flow regime, so that we can understand what you mean and that we can assess and everyone else can assess what the impacts of that are. Does that mean you want less reservoir storage and more variability in winter and spring flows? Does it mean a more natural flow regime also means lower flows and warmer flows in the summer and fall? Is that part of what you're talking about? We just don't know at this point. And so to achieve this aspect required in Water Code Section 85302 E4, you need some specificity. And it's been months. And you've got a 2,000-page EIR that doesn't provide any specificity on the point. And to my mind, before you step over that threshold of recommending to the Water Board what the regulatory objectives should be, You should talk about that in some more detail. And
That
nail
is
down-
not what we're doing. We are not recommending regulatory objectives. I'm sorry. What we are doing is recommending that they consider some alternatives.
And I apologize, and I misspoke there. What I meant was project alternatives that they should consider in their regulatory process. That's the threshold you're stepping over with.
So you want us to analyze what the impacts would be of the alternatives that we're suggesting to them? That's ridiculous on its face.
No, I'm suggesting you need to provide some specificity as to what is the project alternative you think they should consider. That's what they're asking for.
Mr. Stevens, would you just to give us a brief background? We're operating under the California Environmental Quality Act. What's our role? What's our status?
Well, that's
What's the
true,
law?
and I'm not sure. I'll check with Mark if we are actually a responsible agency on this supplemental or equivalency document in the NOP. If not, I would recommend that we actually request in our letter that we are a responsible agency for the sole purpose of the flow objective policy that we have in our plan. I mean, we're going to build into our own plan current flow objectives, and assuming they're updated or they're new flow objectives that are added, we would amend our plan, and those would presumably be incorporated as well. I think Joe's point's a good point. Ryan, you make some excellent points about clarity. We're all trying to see clarity. We're not trying to tell the state board exactly what it should do. Presumably, when the state board does its equivalency document, it's going to do this analysis. We're not trying to do the analysis. We're not going to do the analysis. If we were to even take the bookends of the hypotheticals that you were talking about with regard to storage, cold water pools, warm water at different times, and said, yes, all of that, take a look at that. Pursuant to our statute, we're supposed to put into our Delta plan strategies to restore Delta flows. There's a definition of restoration in our Delta plan. We have to address the issue. I'm recommending that we don't shy away from it, but we don't get down into the details. That's the state board's job. Boilerplate in all the letters that we've sent to date on commenting is that whatever these agencies do has to be consistent with the co-equal goals. The same will be in this letter. And Pat Johnston raised the point. I mean, that's the point. All of this has to fit together. They have to serve the co-equal goals. There was never a suggestion that one objective, one specific set of doing things was going to be the be-all and end-all of the Delta plan, and it still isn't. So the co-equal goals are paramount. They're going to be in this letter. The state board, whatever course it chooses, has balancing. It's going to have to take the co-equal goals into effect, and it's going to have to study the environmental impacts of whatever course it chooses to adopt. So I think that we're receptive. We're trying to be respectful to the letters and the comments, but at the same time, we have to be true to the statute that we have. And our statute mentions flow, up to 15 or 16 times. And it's specific with regard to restoring Delta flow. So, Felicia.
But I mean, it's an interesting, illustration, because I do think my comments about how this was written, sorry, I'm not your lawyer, but my suggestions were how I would write an effective letter to influence somebody. By the same token, it's made possible by the fact that we weren't more specific. Is there a reason why you didn't have a draft letter here or more specificity about the caveats? Because
we just didn't have time, frankly, and at some
you
point,
open the door for it. I mean, I think
I agree
the
with
letters
that.
are an overreaction. I think the comments people are making do make sense to me, and I actually think we should explain when we get to our plan a little bit more about what we mean and what we don't mean about natural flow regime, because we've left open the opportunity for people to assume an extreme that we don't mean. So I think the suggestions all that people have felt more comforted by that you all have talked about, which references co-equal goals and the balancing test. I mean, part of why we haven't said what we think it is precisely because it's the state board's job to do this whole balancing test. Earlier in this process, people got terrified by what they did as the illustration of what the fish would want if they had their way. That was in the statute. They were told to do it. Not that that's what they're going to do. It's clear that's not what they're going to do, but it was to create a bookend so that they would take it into consideration because the people who are working on the legislation were worried they would get blown away, just as water agencies are rightfully concerned that they're not going to be able to meet the water supply needs they want to meet. So all the concerns are valid. The question for me is, how do we give guidance to write a letter that gives comfort, if not conclusions, to people about what we actually mean? And there are all kinds of places in the fifth draft where you're going to be more clear in the sixth draft, I certainly hope, because I have my own list of things that I thought weren't well explained, and we all have those. That's what the draft process is about. So I'd like a little guidance, more guidance on what you can do in this letter to be able to be true to what we're supposed to do under the statute, and yet to also acknowledge that we understand this. I mean, the board's going to get stuff from all sorts of things. They're going to get it from combatants on all sides. We're going to try to write something that skews them towards what their particular interest is. The challenge for us is the co-equal goals and putting them all in a bucket so that the public is served more generally versus picking sides. And so far, I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. It's not all written out yet, but it obviously would have been easier if people had seen a whole letter or a more complete list of those when I started with, like enough caveats so that people know that we don't have some secret agenda to mess up their whatever it is they care most about, which I think most people know we don't, but words are powerful. So how are you going to address that?
My plan was, upon conclusion of this, I've heard all of the comments, is to actually do a draft letter and probably circulate that to the chair and vice chair, make sure that I've covered the issues that I think are appropriate, and then submit it. I should let you know that in the normal run, and what we normally do in our process is we wouldn't bring a comment letter on a notice of preparation to the council. We specifically put this on the agenda, even though we didn't have a letter, because we knew that this was an especially important issue and that we should talk to the council before we did that. And in the normal course of events, we would write a draft comment letter, I'd review it, and then we'd finalize it and send it, because this is the beginning of the process, and we just want to say, pay attention to the co-equal goals, pay attention to these things. So that's what I think we should do in the end, is take into account of all the comments, and then over the next couple of weeks, we will get a draft letter. Mark will draft us something, we'll revise it a few times, and when I think it's appropriate, then I'll circulate it to the chair and vice chair, and they can make comments, and then we'll send it by the 25th. Which is before our next council meeting.
Randy.
I think that's a good approach. I just wanted to comment on what I've heard so far, and that is, if someone were to parachute into this meeting and to listen to all the heat over one line in a staff memo, they'd wonder what we're all about. But this isn't just about one line in a staff memo. This is about ERP1 and months and months and months of dialogue between stakeholders and the council and council staff about concerns about the authority and the execution of that authority on behalf of the state board. And I think it's entirely appropriate that we as a body weigh in on this, that we remind the state of California and the state board that we have an obligation to meet the co-equal goals, and that the state board has authority to go beyond, well beyond addressing simply flows, but to comprehensively look at the situation in the tributaries in the delta and to make recommendations. And we ought to go on record. I think this conversation and we've received testimony from public water agency representatives that represent millions, perhaps, customers, thousands of acres of ag land. We're not hearing from 3 or 4 individuals that are concerned about their pocketbook. They're concerned about their ability to deliver water reliably in the state of California into the future, given the systems that they have to operate with. It's a very real concern. And I agree with my colleagues that a number of the comments that we've received on this matter are germane and important, and we need to consider further as we move forward. So just trying to put that in into some perspective. I'm glad that you brought this memo to us, because I think it's more than just a response to an NOP. This is a big issue, and we need to somehow sort through this and get it right for water supply reliability and the environment.